Welcome everybody to this February installment of our Houston IANS programming on near-death experiences. Um, for those who may be new to the Institute for Spirituality and Health, my name is Cyrus Worrells. I serve as Director of Programs for ISH, and we are a 66, almost 67-year-old member of the Texas Medical Center. And we've done many different things over the years, beginning with hospital chaplaincy, working a lot with biomedical ethics, working within the medical center in initiatives for public health in the broader community, and in exploring all topics related to the intersection of spirituality and health, providing education, research, and service towards fulfilling our mission of enhancing well-being by exploring this deep relationship between spirituality and health. And it was about 4, maybe 5 years ago at this point that ISH began exploring the topic of near-death experiences, or NDEs, powerfully transformative experiences that occur when people are clinically deceased for a period of time, or experience a coma or loss of consciousness and return with these incredibly life transformative experiences. And so, of course, these have profound implications for how we understand spirituality, as well as how we understand what it means to be healthy, what it means to be mortal. And so this will be the really the annual, the 2-year mark on Houston IANS programming. And if you don't know what Houston IANS is, I'm going to turn it over to Pat Johnson to tell you a little bit more about Houston IANS.
Thanks, Cyrus. Houston IANS is part of IANS International, which is the Institute for Near-Death Studies, and they're based out of Durham, North Carolina. And I was involved in a group in Austin for probably 10 years, and a couple of years ago I moved to Houston, and I wanted to continue being part of a near-death community and a near-death support group. So a friend of mine, Kathy Beasley, and myself, we got in touch with ISH, who Kathy had a contact there and had some experience with ISH, and that's how we became partners and friends with Cyrus and everybody at ISH. And it's been a great for us, because they facilitated us in a lot of ways to get this off the ground. Unfortunately, 2 years ago when we started, we had one meeting that was in person, and then of course COVID hit, and ever since we've been meeting in Zoom. The upside to that is that we've been able to get some great speakers like we have today with Pam Kircher, that otherwise wouldn't be available to us. Since we're meeting on Zoom, we can have speakers from all over the country be with us. So that's been one positive of it. And anyway, the support group, or our local ISH IANS group, is primarily here to support people that have had near-death experiences and come back confused and disoriented, and trying to figure out what all of this means and how they can apply it to their lives, and dealing with the changes that a lot of times occurs when you come back from an NDE in your personal life. And so that's our first purpose, is to be there to support and validate people that have had near-death experiences, validate that what's happened to them is real. Secondly, we're here to support family members and friends of people that have had near-death experiences, and not just near-death experiences, but spiritually transformative experiences, which are practically identical to a near-death experience, especially with the after effects and what they deal with when they come out of that. So we're here for to educate and to support the families and friends that are dealing with somebody that is going through those changes. And then thirdly, we're here to educate and support the medical community there in Houston, and a lot of physicians and nurses that run across people that have had near-death experiences don't quite know how to handle it, and have not been exposed to any knowledge of what an NDE is, and how to react to somebody that comes out of an NDE or an STE. And we're lucky today. We have Pam Kircher, who is a physician and practiced medicine, went to medical school at Baylor and did a residency at UT in Houston, and was a physician there for, I think, 25 years. And her husband is a surgeon that was also practicing in Houston, and they have since moved to Pagosa Springs, where they live now. I met Pam at a retreat, the Firefly. It's called the Fireflies Retreat in St. Louis, which is a retreat at an old convent, annual retreat for near-death experiencers. And we met and had a lot of things in common, especially since she had lived in Houston. And she's just a super inviting, just naturally warm person. We had a symposium that we did in Austin a few years back, and Pam was nice enough and came and spoke at that symposium, and everybody just loved her there. So I'd had her on the top of my list to invite to speak to our group for the last couple of years, and lucky for us, she's here today. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, and Kathy I guess I'm turning it back over to Cyrus, and Cyrus is going to introduce Pam and start the presentation.
Thanks.
Thank you, Pat. Well, as Pat said, we're really delighted to have Dr. Pam Kircher with us today. Pat shared a little bit of her bio, the fact that she spent 25 years and did her medical education in Houston and worked in the Texas Medical Center. But he also shared something that kind of was going to be part of my informal introduction, which is, as Pat put it, that she has a very natural warmth. We had this really wonderful conversation about a month ago when we were preparing to do this program. And I was in the middle of kind of feeling in one of those moments of being hurried and kind of distracted and thinking about many different things at once. And so it was kind of one in a series of meetings. And I remember I left our meeting and our conversation just feeling reminded of who I am and what is most important, and a certain kind of common humanity that it seems like the near-death experiences really make so viscerally clear to those who have had them, and other spiritually transformative experiences. They remind us of what really matters. And I felt reminded of that in our conversation. And so I felt so happy that that we have you, Dr. Kircher. I will give a little bit about your bio that Pat didn't share. We know you had an NDE at age 6, which we will talk about, and that kind of propelled you into a life of exploring both medicine and spirituality, as a family practice physician, later as a hospice care physician, as well as becoming a Tai Chi instructor and exploring a wide variety of spiritual practices and modalities, and eventually authoring your book, Love is the Link. A hospice doctor shares her experience of near death and dying. So maybe let's go ahead and get into it. So Pam, thank you so much again for being with us. The first question I had for you actually was, what of your life before your near-death experience do you remember? Who were you as a kid? What was your life like as a kid before your NDE?
I'm delighted to be here, and I asked Cyrus to ask me questions so I could have an interview rather than give a talk. I'm not that fond of giving talks, although I've given a bunch. So I love the interview, and I will say, this will be your shortest answer to any question you ask me, Cyrus. And that is, I had just turned 6 when I had the experience. So I remember almost nothing before the experience. It was one of the first memories of my life. So I actually, I didn't know as a kid whether that's who I was born to be, or whether it had something to do with my near-death experience, because the changes that I discovered when I was in my 40s that had guided my whole entire life, I just thought were me. And it was in my 40s when I read Ken Rings' book, Heading Toward Omega, where I discovered this is what all near-death experiencers change into. So yes, I had no idea that I was what I was like before. So the short answer is I have no idea.
Mm. And that's an interesting experience, because so many of those who we've talked to had their NDE at some point later in life where it was perhaps a shock, or it turned so many things on their head. But for you, it was such an initial experience. I want to ask you kind of how you made sense of it at such an early age. But perhaps before we get into that, can you just tell us the circumstances surrounding your NDE and what you experienced?
Sure. When I had the NDE, I had just turned 6 years old. And what I remember, and I lived in St. Joe, Missouri, just north of Kansas City. And the year was 1950. So I'm just pausing there, 1950. I'm looking at my group, and most of you were not alive in 1950. I see that. But it was a time, some of us were, I know. It was a post-World War II time where we figured the world really thought they had things figured out and they knew how things should be. And I was growing up in a Methodist family, very nice people, and they were very certain of how things were. And I went to church all the time, so I agreed with them. And the experience that I had was developing a sore throat. And over the course on a Saturday, and over the course of the next 2 days, developing, it worked its way into meningitis. So I had the headache and the stiff neck that is traditional for meningitis. And so I remember the intense pain of it all. And in those days, we didn't have a lot of emergency rooms, and no one ever called the doctor on the weekend. It was not heard of. So they waited until Monday morning to take me in to the doctor's office. And penicillin had just been discovered, and he gave me a shot of penicillin and said it might work or she might die. But we have nothing more we can do. So just take her home, but don't let her bounce at all because she has an abscess in her brain. And so I remember Mom told me that only later. She told me she didn't want to tell me at the time because she thought it would scare me. So she didn't tell me until I told her about the near-death experience when I was 42. But what I remember is just having that terrible pain and neck stiffness, and then suddenly being outside of my body, up with a vantage point from the corner of the room. I had no experience with being out of my body and had never heard of such a thing. But I didn't even recognize that it was Pam. I just knew it was me. It was my essence, my soul. And I was up in the corner of the room, and I had no body. I had a kind of a vantage point of seeing, but I had no body. And then I just felt myself completely immersed in God and love, that there was no place where God ended and I began. And that was really the soul that I was before I came to earth. And it was the soul I was feeling in that experience. And I knew it would be the soul I would be when I went back. And I hoped that it might be the soul I'd be while I was here. And that was the whole of the experience. There were no bells and whistles. And then I glanced down and I saw this little girl on the bed, who I could feel her pain. And then I thought, oh, that must be me. And as soon as I thought it was me, I was back in my body. So mine was, by NDE accounts, a very brief one, very brief. Doesn't have a lot of numbers to it or things it does. But what it did for me is it made me feel solid as a soul. I didn't feel like a boy or a girl or a grown child anymore. I was that soul. I knew it was for real. I knew it. There wasn't somebody else out there. There wasn't, there was no way that anyone could convince me of anything else. And almost as much as I knew that, I knew my parents would not be able to tolerate it. I knew it would scare the heck out of them. They were both in their early 20s, and I knew that they would try to fix me in some way. And I knew I didn't need to be fixed. So I never told them. I just lived my life. And so I just want to add a little bit to that. So what does it mean to live a life as an NDEer? What that meant was I recognized I was extraordinarily sensitive to other people. I could not tolerate teasing. I mean, I felt it inside me when someone was being teased. That I knew that wasn't right. And I also felt that oneness with nature and with other people, to feel what it is to be that other person. And I knew that we were here to learn how to love better. And I love what the Dalai Lama says these days, that my religion is kindness. I would say that my religion is kindness. It's the religion of pretty much every near-death experiencer I know. I don't care what we put on top of it, how we theologize it. It's really, my religion is kindness. So that was kind of the beginning of my life, really. I don't remember anything before. And so it has truly guided all of my life, all of my years.
So as you're speaking, I'm hearing kind of the wisdom of the life that you've lived since your near-death experience, and how you've come to understand it. But at 6 years old, you come back and you have this deep sense of knowing, but also this knowledge that your parents aren't going to understand, and this sensitivity to, and this empathy for other people. What do you do with that? Do you tell anybody? How do you make sense of it at 6?
I think some of the answer to that has to do with my own personality, because other people have made other choices, I know. I'm a quiet introvert, and no, I did not tell a single person. I felt that was a gift from God to me. I didn't think I was that special. I don't mean that, but that it was just personal to me, and I didn't need to tell other people. Now, as life has gone on and I've seen what happened to people who told other people back in those days, I was a darn smart little kid, I think, because it didn't always work out very well for people. But I didn't really know. I wasn't that trusting of human beings, I guess.
So you didn't tell a single soul. Was that, on the one hand, you have this deep empathy then as a kid, but then you have this thing that maybe makes you feel different, or that you're keeping to yourself. How did that affect your process of growing up from a kid into a teenager into a young adult?
I think the way I'd answer that is, when you have it at 6 and you've made a decision not to tell other people, I think maybe there might have been people that had been perfectly willing to hear it. I never thought about telling other people after a while. So I just did my life. I was a shy introvert, and that's just who I was. And so I didn't think about it too much. I mean, honestly, when Mark and I were going to get married, I didn't tell him. I thought it was just a private experience I'd had. So I literally didn't tell anybody for 36 years after I had it. And it wasn't something that I had a lot of angst about, that, oh, should I be telling people or something? I know this is not typical for near-death experiencers, but I did not have angst about not telling people. I felt it was important to live those values, but I didn't think I had to talk about it. And in fact, the only reason I ever talked about it was when I was 42, I had finished my residency in Houston and was a family practice doctor at what was called Memorial Southwest at that time, out in Sharpstown area. And people were beginning, it was in the mid to late 80s, people were beginning to insist on talking about their near-death experiences, to talk to, to make their doctors listen or make their ministers listen. And it often didn't work out well for them. The doctors would think they were crazy. They might get a psychiatrist to see them. And the minister would say, well, it could be of the devil, I'm not sure. And so it was not going well. And I thought, the kindest thing I can do at this point, although it's a huge stretch, is for me to talk to the doctors I know. I had done my residency there. They'd known me for 7 years, 8 years, I guess. To give a talk on what this is like, and to say, you know me, and you call me an ordinary person that you like a lot. I'm a near-death experiencer. This is what near-death experiencers look like. They're not all people in psychiatric wards. And so I did it because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted to do it. And my first talk that I ever gave to the docs, I created a slideshow presentation, like a PowerPoint, so I could turn out all the lights and give the talk with the lights out. So I didn't just see their faces when I was doing it, because it was that pretty daunting in the late 80s to do something like that. To their great credit, it's a teaching hospital. So all the residents who were watching this talk, when we got done, they were looking at each other and saying, oh my gosh, is she crazy? What do we say to something like this? And the guys who I had been working with for 8 years, they said, Pam, that's fascinating. I've wondered about this patient and that patient and this one. And they had a robust discussion about, oh, maybe that's what was going on for this person. So it turned out really well, because it was a group of people that I already knew and that already loved me. But it was the beginning of things in my life. It was the beginning of things in my life.
And I know it was Kenneth Rings' book, not Raymond Moody's book, which is often the one that opened up NDEers to realizing other people had these experiences. But for you, the main one that opened you up to sharing was Kenneth Rings' book. Can you share why that one in particular resonated with you?
Yeah, Raymond Moody's book came out in 1975. And in that book, he gave a name to this experience and called it a near-death experience. So that was great to have a name for this thing that I had 25 years before that. And I just went, that's nice. But then when I read, a decade later, really, when I read Ken Rings' book, he had actually interviewed people who had near-death experiences. And I just cried all the way through that book, because I realized that I was just like everybody else. We all had the things I've already talked about. We were all interested in spirituality and learning. We weren't interested in material possessions and success. I read that book and I thought, my gosh, I'm not weird. I'm just a near-death experiencer. And it was such a sense of freedom to know that. So this was, we all come as ourselves. And for me, that made sense in my whole life. The things I had wondered why I was so weird with all this sensitivities, and I wasn't weird at all. I was just a near-death experiencer. I'm gonna, Cyrus, you probably have a list, but I wanted to just touch forth a minute, because is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay, because this once he asked me to do this, my first inclination is no, I don't give talks anymore. But I had COVID and I was too sick to say no. And I thought, that he would kind of try to talk me into it. And I thought, I'll just say, oh, if Zoom works, because I live out in the country. What it did was have me review everything that I had not been reviewing for the last 5 years when I went into retreat. And I went to this great conference that IANS had, and you could get, I'm sure, could listen to it, but I'm going to give you the most important part for me. That happened this month about brain versus mind. And there's this one piece that I thought, how you'd see a conference and probably there's one or two things that you take home and you go, wow, that's what I needed. Well, this was it for me. The new studies now on the mind are looking at what the neural mode network. It's a place in the brain that actually it helps us have our mind wander. It keeps our minds busy on the practicalities of this earth. Now, from your own mind, a lot of that stuff going on in there, you don't really need it, but you can't shut it down anyway. But the new studies now have been looking at meditation. And what they're finding is that people who meditate, and especially if they meditate on a regular basis, that shuts down that neural mode network, shuts it down. And then all that busy chatter in your mind, that goes away and it opens the mind to greater realities, to the more absolute reality rather than the one that we go through every day. And that they're looking now at people with near-death experiences. And that is also true for them, that it shuts that down. That's why they have these expanded shut down. And once it's shut down, and this is important for those of you who have near-death experiences and have wondered about the time of getting over it or getting over adjusting to it, is that once that is shut down, once the filters are quieted, then you're open to more spiritually transformative experiences because those filters have been quieted down, and it can stay for a lifetime. And some of the studies have shown that it takes years to, quote, adjust. I think we're beginning to look at this correlation in the brain and the mind. It's really exciting stuff that I'm glad I lived long enough to see it, because it was always going to be something, but it's really exciting that we're on the peak of that. Yeah. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And thanks for, being willing to dive back into the material that you thought maybe you had left in the past. I had a bunch of questions that came out of everything you just shared. I guess the one that is popping back in, as you said, there's more research being done into kind of these mechanisms. It seems the medical and scientific community is opening up to a more earnest exploration of spiritually transformative and near-death experiences. You said you started giving talks and you were surprised at the reception that you received from your fellow physicians. What seems to be, for someone who, for anybody who works in the medical field, or anybody who's a patient who's tried to talk to their doctor, what kind of way of talking about NDEs seems to pique a medical professional's curiosity as opposed to eliciting kind of that dismissal that so many have experienced?
Such a great question. And I don't think I don't have a perfect answer. I'm thinking some of it is because you have the empathy to just sit there with that healthcare professional for a minute and just feel the energy between you. And don't try to force it on them, because then they're going to back up and say, whoa, but to be yourself and say, this is the experience I had. And it's made these changes in me. And some healthcare professionals are going to listen and some aren't. I mean, heck, I remember one experience I had with an anesthesiologist. People with NDEs are often very sensitive to medications, and I am one of those. And he was about to give me anesthesia for a knee surgery. And I said, really, I need less. And he looked at me and said, no, you don't. And I said, I've had surgery and I do. And he said, no, I'm sure you don't. Well, that man is not someone I'm going to be able to have a debate with, nor do I wish to have him angry with me when he's in charge. I am unconscious in the near future. So I just backed off and I said, well, is it okay then if I tell you when I need more medicine? Because it was knee surgery, it could be kind of the drowsy sort. And he said, I said, yeah, okay, well, just, can I tell you when I need more? And so I was careful to stay under a little bit. I mean, that is more awake, because you never know what he's going to do if he's in charge. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying I'm some miracle worker that every doctor is going to listen to me. That's crazy. Of course not. And that was in recent years. So it's not like after all those years of talking, I still, you're going to run into a doctor that's going to be like that. But the more you can just back away, I've never noticed charging forward as being extremely useful, but that could be my personality.
So another question that came out of what you had just shared about the mind brain and the relationship with meditation. Something you've emphasized to me and something I've talked about with other people in our Houston IANS group, this community, is the relationship of near-death experiences with other spiritually transformative experiences. And I know in our previous conversation, you said spiritually transformative experiences, or STEs, are just as significant, can be just as significant as NDEs. So I wonder if you could say more on your perspectives on that in your life, from your STEs and those you've encountered in your patient care and otherwise.
Yes, I would be delighted to. And when people first began studying near-death experiences, they have the name for it, and now they were studying it in about the 1990, I'd say, in the 85 to 2000, there was a huge emphasis on, was your heart beating? Do you have the studies to prove? Do you have your medical records to say you didn't have a heartbeat? And if a person could not prove they did not have a heartbeat, people that were researchers who were beginning to look into it said, well, then you don't count. And when I started giving talks, I did some to doctors, but I belonged to the Unity Church when I lived in Houston. And I remember doing one at the Unity Church in the evening. And I had several people come up to me and say, I had this weird experience. I wasn't close to death. I really wasn't, but afterwards I had all these after effects that you keep talking about, Pam, but I guess I don't count. And in my heart, in that first one, I knew they counted. That was a problem of people who are into, does a heart beat or does a heart not beat? One of the most profound things about a near-death experience is that, and I'm kind of popping this in here because I always forget to say it, is that people who've had a STE, and I'm going to call NDEs under that, it's one of the STEs you can have. When you have it, most people are much less afraid of death. and afterwards. So the people who are so into did the heart stop beating, it's a fear of death thing. And so yes, so there was no question in my mind I'd say from 1989 when I gave my first talks, that STEs are exactly the same thing. If it has the same effect, how you got there is not so important. And those of you who've been in an IANS group, like I used to do one at Unity when I was there back in, gosh, the early 90s. What we found is people could come if they were interested. The people that had come that hadn't had a near-death experience were always wanting to know the details of the experience, like how long did it last? You know, do you have a tunnel? Do you have this and that? All this Bruce Grayson grouping, you know, of like, do you qualify? And the ones who'd had it, what they wanted to talk about was, how do we feel afterwards? What's our life like? How are we living life? And what is it like to not have that interest in material possessions? They didn't care how long it lasted or what the tunnel looked like or if there was a tunnel. And so to me, that is one of the big things that's happened over the last, what do we think, 30, 40 years, that it's more about the outcome. It's more about how a person lives their life than exactly the details of how you got there.
Beautifully said. And it actually links up with a question I had thought to ask earlier, but which is, you had this powerful experience at 6 that then you shared with no one for a very long time. And yet you had it internally, and later you come to kind of embracing all these other spiritually transformative experiences, and we haven't gotten into it yet, but you've explored all these different spiritual practices and disciplines. And I guess I wonder, it's kind of a two-part question. It's sort of, was there a longing to get back to that place of unconditional love that you experienced at 6? And did that inform your spiritual life and your pursuit of these practices that maybe can bring you into that kind of place or facilitate another spiritually transformative experience?
I would say the experience itself really increases a person's, my interest in spirituality, and not so much about the theology of things. Like, I always loved to go to church. The reason I loved to go to church was not particularly what the minister was going to say. I frankly didn't really usually remember it. But it's that sense that everybody shows, or I'm hoping, everybody is showing up at church because they're all having that yearning to experience the oneness of being part of the way we are all connected together. And so I love this feeling of the church, and I didn't really care what church it was. And I recognize that not every human being who goes to church has that great yearning, but that's what it meant to me. And certainly the yearning for what that was like during my near-death experience, that I think is something everyone yearns for who's had a near-death experience. Having that as much as you can, any experiences that kind of bring that sense of oneness to you. And I wanted to be sure and say today that just because there are some people who are famous and write books, and there are people who are famous and do good talks, and people with a lot of initials after their name, they are no different than anyone else who has a near-death experience or an STE. It's just that they happen to have those other skill sets, you know, like they can talk really well. But don't dismiss yourself or your neighbor just because you haven't written a book. or given a talk, it does not matter. It's what are we all experiencing? And I'm going to give you a personal example of that, since you brought this up, Cyrus. Is I have been a huge proponent and fan of Dances of Universal Peace for about 30 years now, where it's a circle dance where everyone feels the oneness and they use different phrases from different religions. And now that we are finally getting out of COVID, of course, I haven't danced in 2 years. The first thing I did was sign up to do dancing next weekend, because that is the feeling of the oneness. And we don't have to say anything, it's just that it's known. It's known.
So you mentioned the dances of universal peace. Another practice I wanted to ask about was Tai Chi. I know you kind of became a Tai Chi instructor and started some programs for patients, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your experiences with Tai Chi?
Sure. Tai Chi for me is a spiritual practice. It's true. It also does great things for, see that, does great things for balance, and it's a wonderful slow moving exercise that creates a great deal of energy. I taught Tai Chi for older adults, and I taught Tai Chi in hospital settings for people that are recovering. But my favorite teaching of Tai Chi, because I live over here in the Four Corners area and somehow got hooked up with it, I taught Tai Chi to each of the pueblos in the Navajo Nation, because the mothers love to walk. The grandmothers love to walk. It's what they've done their whole lives. And the doctor says you can't walk anymore because you had a broken hip or something. So I taught every single one so that they could teach it to the grandmothers. And the grandmothers could do that slow Tai Chi walking until the day they died. And just being with them and their simple way of living and the way they connect, wow, I certainly got more than I gave. It was just a wonderful experience, yeah, for sure. I'm gonna slip into a couple of other things that are their STE type things, and you were asking me how did I feel about the conference before we started, and well, one of my favorite parts since I started, I'm just somebody who'll just sit there and listen and notice. I don't have to be in charge of anything. And when I was a hospice doctor in Houston, I was in charge of I was a doctor at the inpatient unit. And some things happened that I did not expect. I didn't have any way of knowing that they would happen, but now they're studying them. And I was like, wow, like there was one experience I had, I guess probably 1993, when we had an elderly lady transferred to the unit who had very profound Alzheimer's and had developed pneumonia. And when she got there, she was clearly dying and she was very agitated. And so I called her family and I just sat with her to breathe with her while they came. And to my absolute amazement, and I had the nurse there with me too, we weren't that busy that day. I had the nurse there with me. To my amazement, right before she took her last breath, she opened her eyes, looked into my eyes, and there was no question about her being present there. And it was just kind of a soft smile on her face, and she died. And I would not have trusted myself if my nurse hadn't been there. And she said, Pam, did you see that? And I said, I think I did. But at that time, we didn't know that there could be anything left to look at me with awareness. Now that is one of the studies that they had this last weekend was on consciousness in that state and in the terminally ill that have in dementia. It was just an example of what we had seen. So those individual examples, rather than dismissing them, and that's of course a very general statement I'm making about just about anything. If you see something that surprises you, rather than saying it can't be true because I haven't had it or I didn't read it in a book, don't dismiss it so quickly. It might be absolutely really important. And the same with people visiting with the deceased relatives in the hospice setting. At those beginning times, they were saying, oh, no, that's just hallucination, or that's just them imagining it. No, now they're doing induced after-death communication and doing studies with it. There's so much going on of those things that I saw in bits and pieces, 1, 2s, and 3s, when I was just having an open mind. So I guess that's the word I'd say, is an open mind, is have that open mind for people.
Something I've noticed since the beginning of this conversation, a theme of kind of these powerful moments. I even said when I introduced you that you reminded me in our conversation of in our past conversation of what's most important. And there was a sense of kind of coming back. And the near-death experience is a moment of kind of remembering, as you said, the soul that you are. And then so there's this sense of these moments where we're reminded of, as you describe, oneness and connectedness. And you said when you read Kenneth Rings' book, you realized you're not weird, that you're like everyone else. And then when others said that their STEs didn't count, you said that they counted. You wanted to reassure them that they counted. And that people earnestly go to church for a sense of being a part, being included in something. And you also said that the famous people who write books and give talks are no different. And so I'm pointing out all these moments in our conversation where there's this sense of kind of two things, that the reality that we're all included, and that we all have something very common and a sense of belonging. And it touches me even to say that, because it's been a big theme in my life and probably everybody's life, the sense of being a part or being included. And these moments where we remember that we are connected. And I wonder if it's possible, in your experience, in your life, is it possible to live a life in which you always remember that, to where it's not just in these sacred moments, but if we can live a life that is infused with that knowing?
I'll begin with saying we can certainly aspire to do it. We certainly can aspire. Also, as we get older, because I've been very interested in conscious aging for the last decade or so, since I hit 70. It made me much more interested in conscious aging, or maybe not more interested, but I began really diving into it, and how, as in this time in life, after we retire, there have been no other times in the history of the world that you had this many people be healthy and this old. So it's like a whole new territory, really. And the people who would like to be helpful often talk about, well, maintaining what you always did. And I'm much more interested in maintaining, or asking the question of who can you become? And using this time to really look back at life and say, where do I want to forgive? Where do I need to ask forgiveness from? And feeling how indeed we are all connected. And just because we are not doing, not because we're not running a business, that doesn't mean that we are not having a powerful effect on the people that we touch. And wanting us to remember that about ourselves, the loved ones we have, that I think is the next frontier of this oneness of saying, yes, we're oneness in all through life, and whatever the actual aspects of what we do are. Yeah, it's fine to say that.
Going back, you've touched on some of your experiences in hospice care. I'm working with an Alzheimer's patient, but I'm curious how you ended up working in hospice care, and maybe a little bit more about what you experienced during that time and how your NDE helped you fill that role and be that presence for people at the end of life.
As a general comment, I would say it's extremely helpful for people who've had STEs or NDEs to work in hospice, because they don't have the fear of dying that a lot of people do. And so you can kind of take that off the table, not to preach about it, but to just, it's you, it's what's inside of you. And it just goes along so well with NDE qualities of seeing the oneness and not being in a rush to get things done, but to just really be present with people. For me, it actually started, and I love the way, I think labyrinth is another favorite thing of mine, that for those of you who do labyrinth walking, you walk in the front, you think you're just about to the middle, and then you wander and meander and meander, and finally you get to the middle. Well, that's an analogy for life when we think we know where we're going. So the answer to your question is a labyrinth walk for me. And that is that I was very happy being a family practice doctor in Houston and taking care of generations of the family. And I really enjoyed it. I did it for 8 years. And then the managed care came into Houston. And like anything new, it was very sloppy at the beginning and very hard getting things done with administrators and all. At the same time that I started being more interested in my own near-death experience and talking about it. And then because I was doing that, I'd always had a lot of counseling practice. I have a lot of training in psychiatry. So everybody started, not everybody, but some people who have grief issues would come to me for counseling. And so it all kind of worked together. I had imagined being a family practice doctor in Houston, Texas for 30 years. But after 8 years, those things coming together, I finally one night, and again, this is my part of being an NDE, one night I knew I was unhappy about how things were going with the managed care and all. I just went to bed and I prayed to have an answer in my dreams or in the night, whatever it took. I needed an answer because I was definitely needing help. And in the middle of the night, and this is a true story, y'all, in the middle of the night, I was awakened like at 2 a.m. and with just kind of this message, go to the wastebasket and see what's in there. And I went to the wastebasket in the bathroom, and there was a newsletter there from the Harris County newsletter, which is for the docs in Harris County. And right there, as I opened it up, there was an ad for a hospice doctor. They wanted a hospice doctor. They had been doing a nation search for a year for a hospice doctor. I thought, I just knew that was it. I knew that was it. And I called them the next day and they hired me. And so that's how I became a hospice doctor. And it was probably one of the better decisions I've ever made in my life, because I'm really very well suited to it. Yeah.
In relation to becoming a hospice doctor and being well suited to it, you said it's a comforting presence for people that you don't have the fear of death because of the experience that you've had. But how does that work for someone who hasn't had necessarily a powerful STE or NDE, and is afraid of death? I mean, what do you say to that person who is afraid?
I would say I walk with the person where they are. And if someone wants to ask a question, if someone wants to ask a question, I let them. I'm not dragging anybody anywhere. And when I was working at the hospice, we had, in that same vein that I'm still speaking about what you were talking about, that I was doing some talks in Houston, as I said, and the Houston Post, which was there at the time, I think it's not there anymore, but the guy at the Houston Post wanted to interview me about the talks I was doing. And so I did. I remember I was sitting at my hospice desk, and the coffee right out there on the circle. And I answered the questions, and he did the article. And then about 2 weeks later, the nurses decided that it was a good idea for us to have a bulletin board and feature different people who worked with us, so that people could see us as human beings, not just say the nurse who comes or the doctor who comes. There's a person. So they said, Pam, is it okay if we put that article up there? So I said, sure. They put the article up, and then the family members of the loved ones on the inpatient unit started reading that article, and then they would ask me about it. So I was pretty lucky that that happened. So as soon as they ask me, of course, I can talk about it. And then in the family room, where the families would go, like, when somebody was having the beds changed or whatever, they would get to know each other, and they would be talking about after death experiences or visiting relatives from their loved one. So they began talking about it. And then, to my amazement, the questions that I was then getting when I went on rounds was, so-and-so's had that, a visiting relative, so-and-so's had a deceased relative. How come I haven't? And of course, I don't know how come you haven't, but the more we know people who've had those experiences, the softer our views toward death become. Because while we may not have been the one just this moment to have it, certainly we know people who have. And the more we understand after death communications also, the more we know that it's not wishful thinking when you're awakened by the loved one at night, or you always keep seeing butterflies. That's not wishful thinking. That's after death communication. And you can trust it. The people who've had it, they knew it was real, but nobody else wanted to believe it, so they thought they were just imagining it. So now it's becoming so well known that people can trust themselves. And maybe that would be a big other theme of this, is to trust yourself. When you have something that feels real to you, it is real. Don't let some other guy tell you it isn't.
Wow, what a beautiful message. Getting into all these questions that are of particular interest, and personally to me, that I didn't even write down on my list. But one is, I just asked you about the fear of death, and that for a lot of NDEers, the fear of death goes away, or at least diminishes, or those who encounter someone with an NDE, it softens, as you said. But you also earlier talked about your, if not fear, at least strong anxiety around presenting your NDE to the other physicians, or around sharing it. And often I think we think of the fear of death as the ultimate fear, that all other fears maybe relate to in some way. But here you are with this kind of sense of the peace around around death, but then fear of other things. And I guess I'm curious, what is fear, from your perspective, and how does it relate to maybe the theme of dying, or the theme of inclusion and belonging that we touched on? And when you experience fear, what do you refer to maybe for resilience or encouragement?
I'm going to go ahead and answer that. Then I'm going to circle back for a minute because I didn't say enough about death. But yeah, I think, what do I fear? I'm laughing because we all know that one of the first fear is death. The other is public speaking, I believe. So it's not like a shocker that public speaking, but I'm an extremely shy person. You're not seeing this today because we're having fun together. But as a kid, I would know the answer to questions and never raise my hand because that would mean I'd have to speak in class. So for me to speak before 500 people is like, just hit me in the head instead. It's just like, that's just not my personality. So, so yeah, so that's just me and speaking. But I wanted to go back to death for a minute because I realized I gave you an incomplete answer. And that is saying about, well, people who are in hospice who are afraid of dying, you cannot drag them to being okay with it. You can't. But what I have seen happen fairly often is that as a person gets, even a person who said there's absolutely nothing after life, this is just nonsense. But when they get closer to death and they start to becoming what I call is, it's in the final stages of death when they're coming in and out of their bodies and their mind, and then they're back in their body. And they very often see deceased relatives and people that surprise them, even people that they didn't know were dead because the family members haven't told them because they thought, well, why bother them with it? They just died of a heart attack. They don't need to know because they'll just make them sad. They ask, what is, I say, John, what's John doing over there? I thought he was alive. And the family has saved them the knowing that John had died. So just because I am not helping, I haven't done anything that helps them lose their fear of death, it is not unusual at the very end for people to absolutely have that sense of moving to the other side and the fear of death goes away. So I'm not saying that, that just because the person who's their helper, their caregiver hasn't done it, doesn't mean that it won't happen.
So I want to make space for others to ask questions, although I could probably keep on. But one more question from me before we open it up is that you wrote the book, Love is the Link. And I wonder, I mean, I gather it probably relates to much of what we've talked about, but what inspired you to write a book? And what do you mean by love is the link?
When I was working with hospice patients in Houston, I just jotted down stories every day, not to, just the nidus of the story. I wasn't writing books when I was doing it. And I wasn't sure why I was doing it, but I just felt an inner prompting to do it. And when we moved to Durango, and my life changed so very radically when we moved to Durango, I had some time, and then I had the inner prompting, well, go ahead and just write a book of those stories. And so I thought, well, okay. So I was living in Durango, those of you who know Durango, in kind of a cabin. And so I started writing the stories and I began it. Well, I thought, if I'm going to write other people's stories, I'd damn well better tell my own story. So I put my own story in there first, again, not self-aggrandizement, but more like, okay, you got to be fair. And I started writing the stories, and I didn't know anything about writing a book, nothing. And about 2 weeks into writing, I was going to write 2 days a week because I was working in family practice the other 3. So about 2 weeks, I just writing down the stories, and I did an outline, which makes sense, a table of contents. Well, a friend of mine in Houston, Ken Vincent, had written a book on near-death experiences, and his publisher called me out of the blue one day from upstate New York, called me in Durango and said, I hear you're writing a book. I said, what? they said, well, Ken told them. So I don't want to make it too woo-woo here. Ken Vincent told them. And they wanted a book by a clinician with my stories, kind of stories in it. And this was when Joni went to school, back to school. So it was September of 94. And I said, well, I'm just getting started. And they said, well, just send me what you have. Well, those of you who've ever written anything, I didn't know this, but what they want is a table of contents and a chapter. And I happen to have a table of contents and a chapter, because how would anyone start a book except that? And so I sent it to them, and they said, fine, we'll take it. And just keep writing what you're doing and we'll edit it. And so I kept writing what I was doing, but I also kept teaching, doing family practice and taking care of an 11-year-old. And so it got published in a year. So that also is apparently very quick to get published that quickly. So that's how I wrote the book and why I wrote the book. And I wrote it way back in 1995, and it was published back then. So if you were to read the book, Love is the Link, the title, of course, is about love is the link. We are all connected. We are all part of the oneness. You'll see that those stories in there are just like what they're studying these days now. I didn't make that up. And then also I redid it in 2013, just adding some more stuff that had been done since then, changing some of the wording. Not my wording, that is the NDE wording of new words like STEs wasn't there in that time.
Well, I'm sure people are itching to ask you some questions. For anybody who does have a question, perfect. Gary is the exemplar right now. He's virtually raising his hand. And I just want to say, be aware if you'd like to ask your question directly and speak it out directly, just know you will be included in the recording because we'll be able to see you asking the question. If you'd rather ask your question via the chat, that is welcome as well. And I'd be happy to read out the questions in the order we receive. But first we have Gary, and next we'll have Brother Ed. So Gary, go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Cyrus and Pamela, and good to see you, Brother Ed. I just want to make a couple of comments. The last comment Pamela made was love is the link. That's absolutely true. I had a near-death experience in '77. I started, I'm a psychic, a professional. I've been giving readings since, 1972, 3. And I had a near-death experience in 1977. I was involved in a head-on collision with a speeding car and should have been killed. I was a pedestrian. I didn't get hurt. Do I believe in miracles? Absolutely. And when I left my body, I wrote a whole book about it. It's quite an elaborate description of what happened. But yes, I landed at the infinite mind, and I saw the same thing Pamela just talked about, is love is the link. Absolutely. The love of infinite mind. It's everything we see in life, everything that's ever been created is God looking at itself in infinite ways, making infinite possibilities. Pam was talking about fear. Boy, I've been through it. Everybody goes through it, but I urge everybody to remember, if you never went through fear, you could never learn to be fearless, period.
That's good.
And if it doesn't kill you, you're smarter and wiser. If it kills you, you're back in heaven. What's the problem? Fear is certainly something that we do not have to continue to be haunted by. When you learn to drive, you run into the curb. You learn to play the piano, you hit bad notes. You don't have to keep doing it. It's a choice to turn fear into learning. The reason we fear is we have something to learn. Life's trying to show us something new. And sometimes and we don't always know that. Some people know to seek information, look out, introspection, meditate, as y'all both stressed, amen. Turn off the logical mind sometimes, turn off the TV. But I saw a lot of future events in my near-death experience. I saw COVID-19, I saw 9/11, I've seen all this political strife. I saw pictures of the next 100 years on this planet, and it's challenging. It's very challenging, but we have to see the flaws in our systems, ourselves, our societies to fix them, period. Just like you have to go through fear in order to go, hey, I'm not going to let that trump my life, or bad pun, but intentions. Well, two of the things I suggest, and this kind of goes along with wanting to understand more about yourself and life, want to have more compassion, want to have more growth, you got to practice. A, you got to practice. B, if you really want your guides to help you, you have to ask. Because, and I realized this in my near-death experience from watching my own body get toppled over by a car. And like I said, I didn't get hurt, didn't get a scratch. Brother Ed's read my book, a lot of papers in it confirming what I'm saying. But I feel like the luckiest human being on the planet. Absolutely. Through that experience, I've learned a lot. I'm laying against a bed now. I'm almost completely disabled from my neck to my feet are in constant pain. But you know what? I'm the happiest person on the planet because I get to decide that. And I get to decide that this pain is not going to screw up my life, period. So I ask other people, if you want to grow and learn, don't be afraid of fear. It's showing you what we need to address. Ask your guides to help you read the signs. I'm a psychic. I read signs all the time. In my near-death experience, I went through a week of reading signs. I've never been so scared in my life and never felt so enlightened at the same time. Within 24 hours, life had gone from normal to constant psychic insight, and I couldn't turn it off. And I got so damn scared. Went through a week of that. And then, as Ed knows, I was involved in a head-on collision with a speeding car, left my body. And as I was coming back, I saw all this information about the future. So folks, keep a clear head. There's a lot of change going on. We're having to learn a lot of things. Meditate, ask your guides to help you. And again, love is the link. It helps you conquer fear. And the most important thing in life is perspective, intentions, and attitudes. Thank you so much, Chris, for what you're doing. And thank you for your brilliant comments, Pamela. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary. And I don't know if you've been on, this may be your first session. I can't remember if you've been on previous sessions, but I want to let everybody know, since I'm not sure we shared it at the beginning, that after the Q&A portion, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back for a time for anybody who's had an NDE, you included, Gary, and anybody else, to kind of not compare, but share experiences and talk about the insights, and more at length. So anything you didn't have time to share there, Gary, we'll have more time to share in the circle. Next we have Brother Ed. What would you like to ask Pam?
First and foremost, let me acknowledge, give you a namaste, howdy, and thanks so much, Pat. Dr. Pam, my sister, my mentor, my younger elder guardian goddess, and all y'all who are tuned in here today. I'm going to go off my video because of the channel limitations, and I know it'll lose quality if I don't go off video. What I want to share, if I may, is how powerful and how rewarding it is to serve the dying and their loved ones and family. And Pam and I go back, I don't know, many decades or many lifetimes. It's hard to determine which or both. The power of dying transforms all of us. And as many of you know, both my sweetheart Cheryl and I have had multiple near-death and transformative experiences. And underlying it, I would suggest be careful what you ask for. Because I wanted to ask for, and I prayed for being sensitive. I prayed to God that I would have power, fame, and fortune. Well, I've had a lot of powerful experiences that led to, automobile crashes, death on the operating table, drowning experiences, death of a wife, suicide of a daughter, holding people die in my arms, and being responsible for people's death as my military experience and dysfunctional behaviors have had transformative effects on me. I could only offer the suggestion that if you want to know what it's like to die and you don't want to go through the painful physical process of it, learn to meditate. And meditate is not what you think. Thinking gets in the way of witnessing the light and the sound that resonates between thoughts in our minds and even better in our hearts when we be still and know. Now, I could ramble on about other things. Cheryl, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No.
You're good with it?
Mhm.
Okay, back to you, Cyrus. I look forward to sticking around with all y'all.
Thanks, Brother Ed. So we had two other participants raise their hands, or one. Pat has a question, but Pat, I think before you raised your hand, Jiali's son asked to Pam, how did your NDE influence your path of consciously aging?
I would say that the having had a near-death experience and really being involved in spirituality my whole life, I knew that if I was going to live to be older than I am now, I wanted it to be a blossoming into even more spirituality and more sense of oneness. When I was retired and didn't have, things on the table that I had to schedule and all of that, I wanted to really invest myself in spirituality and meditation. And in fact, I just was, that 2018 is when I spoke in Austin. That's the last time I've spoken since then, because I wanted to live the way that Eastern older people live, and that is in the wilderness, all in quiet, without a lot of things going on, so that I had time to really immerse myself in anything spiritual that felt right to me to do. And that the kindest thing, the best thing I could do was to be the one who was not doing a whole lot, but wishing the world well and in a serious and important way. And so it was just huge for me, I think is the way I would put it, just huge.
Pat, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Hey, Pam, I had a couple things. First of all, you said that in hospice that you didn't drag anybody along as they were nearing death, and you walked with them. What's some advice you could give us, as friends and family of somebody that is taking their last steps? What's some advice you can give us to maybe to comfort them or make their walk easier? And also, I was really inspired today with your thought of your conscious aging, of not what looking at the past, but what you're becoming. It just reminds me of, as long as we have a breath in us, we are expanding and growing, and to be conscious, no matter what our age is, of the opportunity to grow and to and become more spiritually connected. I really like that thought.
I'm going to answer the second question first, and that is, I actually, even though I'm talking about personal experiences, I did take the course in conscious aging from the Institute of Noetic Sciences and became a facilitator, and then had a group here in Pagosa of about 20 of us. We were 60 and over. And then I did a second group next year of just looking at these questions that one does want to consider when aging, of forgiveness and what really has meaning in your life now. So, and I would say that the book I've read recently, and I'm just saying that for people who might want to read one, is Grace in Aging, Kathleen Dowling Singh. That's really quite lovely book to study in the way that one studies and does it, becomes it, not just reads a book. Then when we talk about being with someone who is dying, and this is the most I can say is being present with them, and that means not having my agenda, but having them know that I'm there for them, and I'm not going to have my agenda. They have to do it my way. That I'm going to be as helpful as they want me to be, and recognizing, and this is from hospice work, that when a person gets anxious, sometimes the worst thing you can do is try to relieve the anxiety, because it becomes this circle of they don't feel quite right, so you're going to do this, and now you're doing that, then they don't feel quite right again. So to just rest a little. I remember a story of a family where the wife and mother was nearing death, and we call it terminal restlessness in those last few days of life. She was so restless. She wanted her pillow, then she didn't want it, and everybody was moving everything around. And we finally just brought her into the hospice unit just to have some quiet time, where we put her pillows where she said she wanted it, and then we just left her alone for a while. And she settled herself down after a while. It was just that there'd been so much people wanting to do the right thing for her. So sometimes the right thing is backing off a little. And especially with restlessness, that's what I would comment on. And as best you can, always,
Well,
that's hard.
Relates the next question from. Did I just talk over you?
No, you didn't. I didn't say a word.
Well, I think that relates to the next question that we got from Kim Moore, who asked, when we are caring for people that are suffering, such as with cancer or regular pain, what comfort might be offered based on the near-death experience? But then the second part of that question is, how do you offer spiritual comfort to someone that professes being agnostic based on the NDE? What words can you offer them that are true for them?
At an appropriate time, I would talk about my experience that I found really comforting of, I'm kind of mumbling a minute. My experience where I say I was surrounded by God and I was in God. But the truth is, I say that because that's the language of my childhood, of Methodism and of Christianity. What I really was surrounded by was complete love and peace, with God being the title, but complete love and peace. And I would use that language when I talk to them. about dying. It's not because I did something special for God and now I'm in love and peace. No, love and peace is who we are. And I wouldn't try to convince them to change their whole life's beliefs. I'd be happy with that.
So another question relating to being with people near the end of life. Don G asked, what are your thoughts on how being alone with someone when they die fits in with these experiences? So Don, can you clarify, you mean just you and the person who is dying? And if you'd like to ask your question directly, you're more than welcome to.
Yes, so what I meant was the effect on the person who is with the dying person, in terms of the experience.
Okay, Don. That generally the person who is with the dying person is actually, there was a study that was in that thing 3 days ago, last weekend, that I think was 43% of people who are with someone when they're dying say that it actually decreases their fear of death. It decreases their fear of death because they see that it was not horrible for the person who died. And very often, the person who died had this sense of peace. You could just see the relaxation on their face when all of this life is over. And I think, yeah, and I think that's so often the case. And I want to say this is not the question you asked, but I want to say it. It feels I should, and that is that very often someone will want to be with their loved one and want to provide that support, and feels really bad if they walk out of the room and the loved one dies. That is usually because the loved one didn't want them there when they died. Not because they don't love them, but because they either wanted to be alone or they wanted to spare them that. Believe me, if you've been there a long, long time and then you walk out of the room, if they die, it was the way it was meant to be. Don't kick yourself about it.
Thank you.
Do any others have questions? Oh, I think I just saw Giali, you have another question. Go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Kircher. Actually, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Pam Kircher because through Brother Ed, I got connected with Dr. Pam Kircher, and then we just had a wonderful talk before. So I'm so glad I got a chance to meet you virtually. And then I really think we share a lot of things in common, and then very spiritual. I have my STE, and also I'm a very devoted Buddhist now, and I love Tai Chi and practice over 20 years. And then just so much experience we have in common. And then I just have your book here and I read it, and I really love it. And I got just to feel resonate with a lot of your opinions, your thoughts. And then, for example, you have the metaphor of the veil of the room. Yeah, I can exactly understand what you mean. And also, I think you also mentioned we have different religions or belief systems, no matter Eastern or Western. Basically, we are all human beings. So the love is linked. So a lot of things just yeah, I really believe in oneness, even though for different belief systems. Yeah, I'm not sure if you will stay and for some for the next like half an hour or something. So that's why I jump out and then
I
just I
understand.
want to say thank you very much. Yeah, and hope we can just have more communications.
Me too. And it's wonderful to meet virtually. Yes, it is.
Yeah, and also I think we got linked with Baylor College of Medicine, and I also graduated from Baylor, so we have another alumni things. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's what I have to say right now.
So that's all the questions I see.
No,
Oh,
one
wait,
more.
no. Oh, I see another hand raised. Oh, yeah, Mary Catherine. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Pam. Thank you so much for this. I was wondering, and I'm sorry, I had my grandson, so I don't think you addressed this. How, when you're with a dying patient or their family, how intensely do you sort of relive the feelings surrounding your near-death experience? Or do you?
I think it depends on the moment, because of course I'm also doing hospice. I'm doing work.
Right. You're busy.
But I sometimes do. It's not common. I mean, the thing is, Mary Catherine, it's hard to answer the question, because I
Yeah.
think honestly, I always feel it around me.
Yeah.
So sometimes I feel it maybe more intensely.
Mhm.
And I remember one night, I say night, it was 6 o'clock probably, but it was wintertime, that I had just finished rounds and done all the business of things. And we had a man in his 40s or 50s who was dying of cancer, who had had a near-death experience in his life. And when he said, could you come back when you're all done with everything else? And I went back, and his wife said, I know what he wants to talk about, and I can't stand to be here while you guys do it. But she let down the cafeteria, and what he wanted to talk about is us reminiscing about our NDEs, and just spending the light with the dark was kind of coming in, and just really, it was like two people sitting around a fire talking about the high point of their lives.
That's
And
beautiful.
and he went unconscious that night and died the next day. So yeah, so I mean, it's that when it's that intensity, and I went home thinking,
You wanted that release, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So it was very special.
yeah. Thank you.
So I know we're at 3:36. We did just get one more question. Pam,
Okay.
that I hope you have a moment to answer.
I do.
From James, who said, thank you for talking to us. And what can someone who has no spiritual self learn more? Or I guess, how can someone who has no spiritual self learn more? How can such a person come to believe and to explore?
I like the idea of coming to an IANS group and listening to people talk. I think you're listening to other people's stories. And I will say to you that because I never talked about my near-death experience to anyone until I was 42. About 2 years later, I went to my first national IANS group, and it was in Georgetown. I remember because it was so remarkable. In my opinion, I had never met anyone with a near-death experience or any kind of profound religious experience. And when I got there and there were all these people that had all these experiences, I was flabbergasted that I had walked through 44 years of life and never met anybody who had the experiences like mine, which of course was sheer nonsense. What it meant was I had been very carefully closed so that no one could know anything. And I recognize that at the moment. But sometimes it's just opening up to anything. I mean, sure, hearing talks and reading books is good. But for me, the experiences in my life that have meant the most is when I have been in the presence of someone who really lived from love. And I didn't have to know what their beliefs were. And people can live from love with no beliefs in a God at all. They can live from the oneness. And so I think that we're all part of that oneness. So yes, I certainly, I'm thinking about like sometimes a movie really can, like when I saw Ghosts, it's like a violence in it, but that idea at the end of the oneness, that was really important to me when back in the early days when I was just starting to talk about it. So I think I don't feel quite finished, the very wanting, the very desire, the very aspiration to feel the oneness helps to bring it on, because you're just sitting there waiting for it to show up in your life, and not being and being open-minded, saying, I don't know where it's going to come from, but it's going to come. And I wish you well. I wish you well.